One of the first lessons that my parents taught me was how to share. I'm not sure it held, but we'll be the judge of that when we get to glory. As soon as I could comprehend things, the method of sharing was prominent in my house. Both my parents screwed into my conscience the importance of sharing with others, fundamentally because, after all, Jesus shared with us his love, his goodness, his kindness, and he meant for us to share it to others. And so that was the bedrock moral lesson my parents give. You know, Jesus shared, Brian, so you can as well. And so from that early age, I spent most of my life sharing my space, sharing my toys, and sharing my food, whether I liked it or not. In fact, more often than not, I begrudgingly did it. I would, because Jesus expected me to, and my father and mother's stern commission of me to do so, had to sleep on my floor of my bedroom when family came to town, in the voice of sharing. I had to wait for the pastor and his 5 kids to pick the best part of the chicken on Sunday dinner because I was expected to share, and more often than not, I got the wing, the bony piece of the wing, I might add. But I, by golly, shared with them because that's what Jesus asked me to do. And there were many days after Jesus sharing type of love with over hyperactive kids who did not have to know how to control themselves in my bedroom, had to spend the afternoon gluing my broken toys together again, all in the spirit of sharing. So you can tell that I'm still a little upset with that over all these years. Of course, there are times where sharing, though virtuous and though praiseworthy, can actually be dangerous and destructive. I was taught not long after that is experienced that it's not a good idea to share a unicycle, for example, something I tried to do and ate dirt and asphalt later. It's not virtuous for professional counselors to share confidential information with the public. That is a career killer. And more dangerous still, it's not good that a husband should share marital intimacy with someone other than his wife. Bad things happen when he shares that. So not all sharing can be good. There are some things in life that are so sacred, they should remain exclusive. And when we come to Exodus 20 and our eyes descend on verse 3, which is sort of the foundation of the Big Ten, that all of them come out after, we see that there's one thing in the universe God is not going to share with anybody else, no matter what they might think about him, and that is he will never share his glory with anybody else. It is too sacred. It is too precious. It is too godly that it is to remain exclusive. And so today, as we begin our pilgrimage in the 10 Commandments, this command stands like pink neon blinking lights in an Amish run town. I mean, you're going to stick out like a sore thumb, and that's exactly what verse 3 would do if you're Israel. So let's pause a moment and know the background of Israel and why this is such a provocative command for them. Now remember from last week and from earlier weeks that the events of chapter 19 and 20 of Exodus, so says chapter 19, occur 3 months after Israel have left Exodus. 3 months, 90 days, they are now receiving this command. 90 days before, they were still slaves in Egypt. But now 90 days after, which is shorter than the time you and I last celebrated Halloween. 90 days ago, they were slaves. Now, all of a sudden, so says verse 1 and 2, they're free. They're redeemed. They're no longer slaves. Before that, if you needed a reminder, they were slaves in Egypt for 430 years. Their grandfather's grandfather was born a slave in Egypt. So to compare 4.5 centuries of slavery, unredeemed people, to 90 days, this is all new, is like comparing a drop of dew on the morning grass to the Pacific Ocean. It is incomparable. So all this talk of the Ten Commandments are going to be new to these people. And we know what their life was like in Egypt because we're told. And it's very important you know this so you understand how sweet the Ten Commandments are and how to properly interpret them. While they were slaves in Egypt, 2 bad habits happened. And we know this because of where we have been and because of where we are going. First, according to Exodus chapter 4, and according to great lengths in chapter 6, God lets Moses know in clear terms that while in Egypt, Israel was not allowed to worship Yahweh. So they had no way of worshiping God. They may have known about God in memory through the covenant he gave with Abraham, but I would make a case that 430 years of not being allowed to worship Yahweh, not only could they not, but they wouldn't know how to. 4.5 centuries of not being allowed to worship the one true God. And on top of that, we are told from several passages. One at great length is Ezekiel 20, where God gives a history lesson of being back in Egypt. We are told that during those 430 years, not only was there the absence of the worship of Yahweh by Israel, but there was the presence of worshiping many gods by Israel. So, the history lesson in Ezekiel 20 is that God told Israel when they left Egypt, they were to remove all of the household gods of Egypt before they left, which implies that Israel was, when in Rome, act like the Romans. So they were disallowed to worship Yahweh for 430 years, and we know that they were encouraged by a pagan ruler in a pagan land with pagan policies and pagan practices to worship many pagan gods. And Egypt had 80 of them, at least major ones that I know of, and maybe a lot more. But 80 major deities given for every times of the year, for every season, from land gods and goddesses to rivers, to air, to ground, to crops, to autumn, to harvest, to winter. They had gods for everything, and they're all over the place, and they're equally doled out to be worshipped, and Israel, we're told, worships them. And so you need to understand that they've been used to that for 430 years. They've been rescued, they've been redeemed, as God points out to them in verses 1 and 2. I've redeemed you from that life, And so now, as God does to anybody he redeems, it's out with the old and in with the new. When God redeems a people, it's always a whole new world that they're exposed to. And with that as our backdrop, the Redeemer, speaking to his redeemed about the redemption, says, if you want to look like me and you want to look like newly redeemed people, you will have no other gods before me. That's commandment number 1, right? The old life of not being allowed to worship me, the old life of worshiping pagan deities, it's over. Why? Because of verse 1 and 2. I have redeemed you. I was the one who brought you out of that life. And I am to make sure you don't look like anybody else in the world. And if there's one thing the world is good at in this time and in ours, it's they have many gods that they like to worship. And God says to his people, those days are over. To look separate so that you're attractive to the world, that you're a light to the world, that they can come in and become part of Abraham's family, you're not to have any other gods before you. Now that you understand that, how would Israel have understood this command? How would they have applied it? What does it mean to have no other gods before you? There's a lot of talk of what people think this means. Let me tell you primarily how Israel would have understood this and how I think Jesus, our teacher, would instruct his people to apply this command. First, let's look at how Israel would have understood it. There are 2 sections of Deuteronomy that I want you to turn to. The first is in chapter 6. So if you would turn there, and then we'll walk through this. Here's the first command. What does it mean to have no other gods before Yahweh? This, of course, is upon which the second and third command is based. We'll get into that in a few weeks. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 6 of Deuteronomy. Now, these are the commandments, statutes, and ordinances that your Lord, your God, instructed me to teach. So let me pause a moment so you understand what this is. That's all the law that they've been received prior to Deuteronomy 6, which would include the 10 commandments that we're talking about. So that's lumped in here. Why did God ask me to give you the law? That's Moses to Israel. So that, there's 2 things here, so that you may carry them out in the land where you're headed, and that you may revere the Lord your God, that you will keep all his statutes and commandments that I'm giving you. And not only to you, but to your children, to your grandchildren, to all your lives, to prolong your days. So that's the backdrop. This is the commands I'm giving you, which includes the 10 commandments, which includes Exodus 23. Here's the reason I'm giving it to you. And then notice how they start with the command. It is a restatement of Exodus 23. Do you see it? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. This is known and becomes known as the Shema, which is actually recited twice a day by all Jews. Still is, by the way. So, that is a restatement of the first commandment. Have no other gods before me. He is a one God. He's the Lord. And then this is how Israel would have understood what this command is and how it is to be obeyed. The next verse. You must love the Lord your God with your whole mind, your whole being, and with all your strength. Israel would have understood the first commandment to be a commandment of total devotion, absolute affection, your complete and utter love above all others to Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So this is redemptive covenantal language now. It's again, not like we said last week, it's not moralistic. It's I'm entering into a relationship with you as your God that's newly redeemed you, and I want you to love me unlike you love anyone else, particularly the other gods. Now, if you turn to the end of Deuteronomy, you see the same thing. Generations elapsed, and they still understood this to mean this way. Deuteronomy chapter 30, beginning in verse 11, when you get there. This commandment I am giving you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it too remote. It is not in heaven, as though one must say, who will go up to heaven to get for us and proclaim that we may obey it? It's not across the sea, as though one must say, who will cross over to the other side of the sea and get for us and proclaim it that we may obey it? For the thing is very near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your mind. So you can do it. I love this literary device. This commandment is not difficult. All right? It's very easy to understand and obey. Verse 15, look, I've set before you today life and prosperity on the one hand, and death on disaster on the other. What I'm commanding you between life and death, what I'm commanding you today is what? To love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to obey his commandments, his statutes, his ordinance. Then you will live, you'll become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you're about to possess. However, if you turn aside and do not obey, but you're lured away to worship and serve other gods, here we have the first command at stake. Have no other gods in front of me. Love me completely. If you go away and you start loving them, then you die. Bad things happen. You will not extend your time in the land. This is continue on in verse 18. You'll certainly perish. And verse 19, today I invoke heaven and earth as a witness against you, that I have set life and death, blessing and cursing before you. Therefore choose life, so that you and your descendants may live. I also call on you to love the Lord your God, to obey him, to be loyal to him. For he gives you life and enables you to live continually in the land the Lord promised to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Love me, Israel. Love me with everything. Love me completely. That's what I'm asking as your Redeemer. Don't go after other idols. Don't let your affections be drawn to them. That is disaster to share my love with them. But love me. I've used this example before, but it fits here. Let's suppose that I go home today because the lovely and gracious Anita is at home in bed sick. And I think she shared her sickness with her husband. She should not have shared that. She should have listened to the sermon. So I have this massive head cold, like many of you have. But suppose I go home today and I give her a dozen red roses. And I say, sweetie, baby, I love you, like I do every other woman. Now, I know what the lovely and gracious Anita would do, and she would at that point neither be lovely nor gracious. You know, she loves to hear the first line, right? She can't hear that enough. I can't tell her that enough, that I love her. But what she doesn't want to hear is that she's in the same stadium as every other woman in my life. She wants to know she stands in a class all to herself, which is, by the way, appropriate and right. This is precisely what the first command is. Israel, you're my redeemed people. I redeemed you as your redeemer. I brought you out of slavery. And now I want you to love me not like you do every other god out there. Your love for me is to be in a class all to itself. It's to dominate you so much that the verbiage is with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. I want you to be thinking about me. I want to dominate your affections. I want you to get up in the morning and go to bed with me on your lips. I want you to not be able to get enough of me, your redeeming God. That's the command, to have no other gods before him. And Jesus understood this because he uses it, at least by my count, 8 different times in the Gospels. The single most prolific command that he uses in the Gospels. You recall that Jesus, like Israel, when he first starts off in ministry, he also winds up in a wilderness. There, for 40 days and 40 nights, we're told in Matthew 4, by being tempted by the devil. There, the devil gives him 3 temptations. They're all crouched in what our culture fights against. The first line that the devil offers Jesus is what Jesus could do for himself. So we would call that an entitled temptation. The second temptation is what the Father ought to do for Jesus. So the devil is subtly trying to drive a wedge between Jesus and the Father. That can never be successful, by the way. But the third is what I want to highlight, is what the devil suggests he can do for Jesus in exchange for something Jesus can do for him, which, by the way, the devil had no authority to ask. So if you're of that camp that believes a yin-yang devil Jesus, you need to go back and read and study Matthew 4. What happens there? The devil says, look at all the kingdoms of the world and I'll give it to you. He had no authority to give. That's the joke. That's the lie. Which, by the way, the devil's still doing in our lives. He's offering us things he cannot possibly have the power to give us. And so he offers Jesus a lie. Jesus knows this, doesn't take the bait. But what does Jesus say? Jesus pivots and goes back to the first commandment and says, you will worship the Lord your God, and only him will you serve. Satan, you're not even talking Bible to me now. So Jesus knew a thing or two about this attack, and he pivots towards Scripture again. But throughout his ministry, he will be accosted again and again, by my count 8 times, more often than not by the religious establishment, where they will come to Jesus, so says Matthew's Gospel in chapter 22, in order to trap him. And they ask, what is the great commandment? And he goes back to the first and says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. More of that as we get into the 10 Commandments. And then he adds, upon this commandment hangs all the law and the prophets. This commandment is the linchpin of all of your Bible. Love God with everything. Earlier on in Matthew, he will say something he again says repeatedly throughout the Gospels, which causes us sometimes to scratch our heads when he says, whoever loves father or mother, sister or brother more than me is not worthy of me. We'll get to that when we hear God say how he's a jealous God. Imagine that. He is not saying you shouldn't love your father or mother. He is saying, I demand supreme affection. I demand love above all other loves. Now, before we apply this pesky little thing to our lives, let me show you one verse in how I think Jesus takes the first command and interprets it to his day redemptively. And that again is the Sermon on the Mount. So if you go to Matthew chapter 6, because it's very important that you see this. Now in the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon preached by the way, by the greatest preacher who ever lived. No preacher holds a candle to Jesus, I assure you. Just his literary devices are another world. And while he never cites Exodus 20, verse 3, like he cites other commands that will follow, clearly the comparison is going on that we find in Exodus 23. It comes up in Matthew 6 in the context of money and possessions, and what often happens by people who are lured away in this world by money and possessions, that they worry about it. So 3 times in this section, Jesus will say, do not worry, do not worry, do not worry. And so that's the contrast. And it comes to this climax in verse 24 of Matthew 6. No man can serve 2 masters, for he will either love the one or hate the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. Now if you have the old Revised Standard, the standard I grew up memorizing, you cannot serve God and mammon. And when I memorize that as what is that? Then we translate, it's money, okay. But mammon, if you have an old Revised Standard, it's capitalized, right? That's right. Because mammon in Jesus' day is a pagan god that the Syrians actually worshipped. It's a deity. And so what Jesus is doing in this context is he's pulling this combat language of loves from Exodus 23 and says, what is at stake in all of our lives is you can never have divided loyalties. You can't love 2 things equally at the same time. They will compete for you. So just ask Jacob when this was attempted to him. He falls in love with Rachel. You read about his love for Rachel. I mean, this is a true love. He will work for this lady. I mean, when I get to heaven, I got to see what she looks like. I mean, he's going to work 14 years without any payment. And then he's shanghaied by her father-in-law halfway through. But what does he say? It's beautiful, isn't it? Because of his love for Rachel, the 14 years seemed like 14 days. Now, this is a footnote. I'm only going to say this. This is not what that point of the message is, but I wonder how many marriages we can say like that, right? Or do we say it in reverse? If you can say the 14 days spent with you is like 14 years, you may want to get counsel, right? But Jacob said, it was nothing, Rachel. Was I lied about by your father, by your dad? Yeah. Was I stolen from yeah. Was I mistreated? Yeah. But you were worth it. But in the midst of this love, you remember what happens. Laban, a pagan, by the way, with many household gods, pimps out his oldest daughter, in disguise, mind you, because he knows Jacob won't take her in broad daylight. And they become intimate. And she uses that, Leah, as a means to draw his affections to her. She cranks out 10 babies. And she uses her sons as trophies, as a means to bait Jacob's love. All the while, if you remember the story, it's quite clear what the storyteller's doing. All the while, Rachel is barren. So Leah now uses her sons to gain favor to Jacob. In fact, there's one story in the middle of this where she negotiates Rachel to have Jacob one night so she can bear another kid. But something happens. They grow up, they grow old, and Leah's boys begin to resent Rachel's 2 sons, because she eventually has 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. And we're told in the Genesis account that the boys resent Rachel's boys because they belong to Rachel and they know that Jacob loved not their mom, he loved Rachel and favored her and her children. What's the lesson? There are no divided loyalties. You can't have them. No man can serve two masters. He will either love the one and despise the other, or he will be devoted to one and then hate the other one. You cannot serve God and mammon, the mammon, by the way, being the pagan deity of money and possessions. Upon my father's death, before he died, he gave me a lot. My dad was what you would call a pack rat. Okay, so my father was born in 1936. So he was born right in the middle of the Great Depression. His brother went to World War II. He went to Korea. And so when he died, I'm sure he was in glory laughing his head off. Ha, 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 you got to do this. Because I literally threw out and burned 12 tractor trailer loads of junk that he kept. I mean, he kept newspaper, the Kansas City Times from 1968, and it had no value. They were yellowed, they were tattered. But he would always say, don't throw that out, you may need it someday. Okay, well, no, we're throwing it out. I mean, baling wire, are you kidding me? So he deeded me, or he gave me rather, his comic book collection. And my father had about 200 comic books. He was big into collecting Gene Autry and Roy Rogers comic books and the original Batman, Gangbusters. But there was a comic book from the 1920s and 30s that he had about 4 of them. And I loved just the storyline. And it was a comic book called Mutt and Jeff. And Mutt was a tall, slender guy. They were friends. Mutt was a tall, slender guy with a mustache, and Jeff was a short, portly fellow who was bald. And they got into every comic was them getting into some sort of mess. In the particular comic that I read, Jeff had opened up a diner, and he was the chef of this diner, the owner, entrepreneur, and the cook. Jeff was walking along the street and saw in the window, grand opening at this restaurant, Jeff's Diner, rabbit stew, 5 cents. I wish it was that much. This was 1920, right? And Mutt said, I love rabbit stew. My mom made rabbit stew. My grandma made rabbit stew. I can't wait. So he went in, slapped the nickel down and said, I want rabbit stew. And Jeff brings the rabbit stew and he begins to taste it and he spits it out. Says, this is the worst rabbit stew I've ever eaten in my entire, it's rancid, something's off. This is not the rabbit stew that I grew up. What did you do? And we called him some name. And he said, well, I didn't, I only had one rabbit, so I added a little something to the stew. And he said, well, what did you add? This meat is not all. He said, well, I added a little horse meat to it. And a horse? How can you add horse? How much horse did you add to this rabbit stew? He said, 50-50. He said, what do you mean 50-50? He said, 1 horse and 1 rabbit. and that was the gist of the comic. You cannot divide loyalties. And God is saying, as is Jesus, God doesn't do 50-50. He doesn't do one Jesus and one other God together. It spoils the whole thing. No one can serve 2 masters. You must love me with everything, with your whole heart. And we see this again throughout Scripture, don't we? In good ways. Noah loves God for 600 years in the midst of a pagan culture that would mock him every day from building that ark. Abraham would be willing to give up his one and only son back to God because he loved God and obeyed his voice. The 3 Hebrew boys refused to bow to that statue, and they reasoned that it would much better die being faithful with our love than to bow down. Paul would say, I count everything in life loss for the one thing of apprehending Jesus. Mary would break open a perfume bottle and anoint Jesus' feet, a perfume that cost a year's worth of salary. But for her, it didn't matter. Jesus was worth every penny. And David's moniker is he's a man that hunted down God's very heart. Brothers and sisters, what does this mean to us today? The dangerous world we're living in is in the years of the ancient world, gods were named. They were chiseled out in stone. You could see some image and bow down to them. But our gods are not given names, but we nevertheless worship them with great fervor. And your God, your redeeming God, says, you want to look like me. You want to act like me in this world. I have no competitors. You love me supremely above all others. Some of us every day are tempted to bow down to the God of money, who promise us that if you have enough of it, you'll be happy and content. But that money God is no competitor for the redeeming God, who now and throughout eternity say that salvation is of God alone. Money can't buy it. Some of you tomorrow will get a knock at the door of your soul, and you'll be tempted to open it because you have every day before breakfast. And the God and goddess of worry will come calling, and you'll be tempted to bow down to them as you have so much to be anxious about something. You're the kind of person like my great-grandma was, who if she wasn't worrying about something, she would worry about that somehow she missed something. It is a wicked God that you serve, the God of worry. It is a God and goddess that you bow down to every day in your anxiety that directly combats the God of peace through His gospel alone can bring peace to your soul. Some of you this week will be tempted to worship the God of stuff, materialism. Bigger houses, bigger stuff, bigger Amazon accounts, bigger closets, just to have more stuff, because to you, that's what people do. But we know that that cannot compete with the love that we have of a Redeemer, whose redeeming love only can fill our heart with joy. Some of you, as most Americans will do at some point this week, will be tempted to worship and serve the God of self-esteem, believing the lie that in fact you are the center of the solar system, that everything, every decision, every feeling hurt revolves around you. You are the member of your Holy Trinity. But your self-esteem does not compare of the clarity of Jesus' gospel, where He is Lord of all. You will join or be tempted to worship the God of sports. We will definitely be tempted to worship this God this week, won't we? The God of sports can never bring the exhilaration like Jesus, who, if the Chiefs, for example, do win the Super Bowl, and no one will be happier about that than I, because I grew up in this city and I know names like John Malkovich and Bill Kinney and Todd Blackledge, right? The wasteland of football. And so we're living in, I mean, more of it. I could care less. I used to be, when Tom Brady played, then everyone was mad at me because they win all the time. Well, you're not mad now. You're not mad at me now because you like winning, don't you? And so we'll be tempted to bow down to this God. But as important as it is to know we like the Chiefs, guess what? One day, history will forget about them. One day, they won't be good anymore. But our God rescues us from hell, something that sports cannot do, and is worthy to be praised of that. I could go on and on with this sort of thing. The God of sex cannot bring satisfaction of 1 minute in the presence of Jesus. The God of entitlement can never make demands that they should be saved outside of God's grace. The God of bitterness that so many of you tempted to bow down to cannot snuff out the delight that Jesus' forgiveness brings. The God of ambition cannot gain the power of grace in Jesus. The God of indulgence cannot provide fullness of the soul like Jesus. The God of intelligence can never know the depths of the mind of Christ like knowing him in the gospel. The God of fame and influence that we see prolific, particularly in social media, can never amount to a hill of beans like the King of all kings and Lord of all lords, who every breath of heaven is praising night and day. The God of status and job can never supplement the work and service that is done for the worship of God. The God of appearance, the God of entertainment, the God of technology, the God of family. Oh, and another big one that irks me that I battle with as well as seeing others battle with is the God of feelings. If I hear another Christian say to another Christian, well, you hurt my feelings, I'm going to be a rich man, because I hear it all the time. Well, might I say that, I'm not to say we should be rude and jerks, but that is not a God to be worshiped, because it's fallible and impotent, and can I say, wrong most of the time. But Jesus and Jesus alone. He is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the King of kings, the one and only one worthy of our worship. As many of you know, I am a student of church history. One of my favorite heroes, dead heroes, that's mainly who I talk with. I talk with dead people. Through books, not through clairvoyance, right? One of my favorite heroes. And he has ministered to me many, many times. In fact, I've read what only survives as a few of his letters. And I will actually laugh. I'm thinking, I thought my life was bad. And that is Patrick of Ireland. He has been a friend to me for many years. Curiously, Patrick is not Irish. He was English. He's only Irish because of his notoriety. He was a son of an Englishman, an English merchant, and he was kidnapped by Irish warlords, taken to Ireland, and for the next 10 years, way up into his teenage years, he was forced into slavery to be the personal slave of the Irish warlord who kidnapped him. He escaped in his late teenage years, made his way back to England, and for the next 5 or 6 years wrestled with bitterness. How could a loving God make him go through such abuse as a child? What kind of God allows kids to be kidnapped and taken to a foreign potentate and abused like Patrick? And Patrick had to wrestle with this, and finally, he came to faith in Jesus Christ. And he turned his bitterness to joy and forgiveness, and spent the rest of his life in dedication to go back to the very people who kidnapped him and share the gospel. If you've read anything of Patrick, you find that he made his way back to his Irish warlord, who for a decade made his life a living hell. He shared the gospel, and that warlord came to Christ under Patrick's preaching. All Patrick had in his satchel to take was a copy of a Bible and the Nicene Creed. That is all he took. Upon his death, over 1,000 Irishmen came to Christ because of the preaching of St. Patrick. There is a particular story that is a favorite of mine, and in a few moments, I am sure will be a favorite of yours. It involves another pagan king. They had these tribes and villages back then. I've heard it pronounced so many times, so I'm going to really butcher this, but Logair of Tara. Logair is pronounced different ways depending on who you ask, but Logair of Tara. They were in the festival of worshiping their pagan deities, and this would culminate at a giant bonfire set on Slane Hill in Ireland. So King Loghaire commanded all Irish people not to light their houses at night before the pagan festival feast of all these deities would happen, that would culminate at the bonfire of Slane Hill. So think of it as their Christmas. No lights until Christmas. Everyone, because they did not want to incur the wrath of King Loghaire, acquiesced because they're pagans. All but Patrick, who, this Christian man in a new tribe, purposely began to light a candle every night and pray to the one God of the universe, Jesus Christ. Loghaire and his soldiers saw this in direct defiance of the king and ordered a battalion of guards rushed to Patrick's home, where they confiscated Patrick, brought him publicly, what they thought was for punishment. And King Loghaire, so touched by this one man, this one Christian, not a warrior, his defiance of the king, that not only did he not punish Patrick, but he came to faith in Jesus Christ as well. 3 centuries later, Dalán Fagel wrote a hymn in honor of that defiance of St. Patrick at Slane Hill. The hymn was called Be Thou My Vision, a hymn in dedication to the faithfulness of St. Patrick, who quite literally believed that there should be no other gods before his own, Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know if you know that hymn by heart. The original stanza has 16 stanzas. I won't quote them all to you. I'll quote one you love, as do I. Thinking of that story and thinking the backdrop of that story is the conviction of Exodus 23. And Jesus in our ear, no one can serve 2 masters. Love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Fallen writes this: riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou, mine inheritance, now and always. And here is the line. Do you know it? Thou, and thou only, first in my heart. High King of heaven, thou treasure, thou art. To God be the glory. Father, I thank you for this assembly. I pray that we would have an insatiable appetite toward your word, which always points us to you, sweet Jesus, our Redeemer. As redeemed people, help us to love and obey you above all else. We are bombarded with many affections every day, every week. Help us that you will be first in our heart. This we ask in the name of Jesus, our Lord, and for his sake. Amen.